Hey guys, tonight we're exploring the most ancient and most human act of survival together, as we begin with the idea that stories are not entertainment. They never were. They are the oldest technology human beings ever invented for staying alive, not physically, but psychologically, for making the unbearable bearable, for keeping the self intact when everything around it is trying to take it apart. And no one in history understood this more completely than a young woman in a Persian palace who told stories every night for 1,001 nights to keep herself from being killed. Right now, as you're watching this, someone else is watching it too. A different country, a different time zone, a different life, but the same quiet hour. Tonight we're exploring the king who listened to stories and the woman who saved herself by telling them together. If this is your first video here, take a look around. Subscribe if it feels like home. And leave a comment, your location, your time. That small act of saying, "I'm here," does something. It reminds all of us that we're not as alone in this as the dark sometimes makes us feel. Dim the lights. Maybe pull a blanket over yourself if there's one nearby. Let's begin. Before we enter the Persian palace, before we meet Scheherazade and the king who wanted her dead, I want to start with something you already know. You have done this, not on the scale she did, not with your life literally at stake, not across 1,001 nights, but you have done a version of what Scheherazade did. Every time you took something that was happening to you, something painful, something frightening, something that felt like it might break you, and you found a way to frame it, to narrate it, to say to yourself, this is what is happening, and this is what it means, and this is how I am going to get through it. Every time you told yourself a story about your own life that made it possible to keep going, you were doing what she did. Human beings are, at the most fundamental neurological level, storytelling creatures. Not because we enjoy stories, though we do, but because the brain itself thinks in narrative. It takes the raw, chaotic, often senseless stream of experience, and it organizes it into story form almost automatically. Beginning, middle, something that functions as an end, cause and effect. Meaning, this is not a luxury. It is a survival mechanism. The brain that cannot make a story out of what is happening to it is a brain in a state very close to trauma, overwhelmed by experience it cannot integrate, cannot make sense of, cannot place within any framework that allows for forward movement. And Scheherazade understood this intuitively, powerfully, with a clarity that the psychology of narrative is only now beginning to fully articulate 4,000 years before the research existed. She understood that a story can change a mind, that a story told at the right moment in the right way can reach somewhere that argument and reason and pleading cannot reach, that stories do not just describe reality, they construct it, and that the person who controls the story controls, to a remarkable degree, what happens next. Now let us enter the story. In ancient Persia, there was a king named Shahryar. He was powerful, just, and by all accounts a good ruler until the day he discovered that his wife had been unfaithful. This discovery did not just break his heart. It broke something more fundamental than that. It broke his understanding of the world. The story of betrayal is one of the oldest in human experience. And what Shahryar experienced is what psychology now recognizes as a particular kind of traumatic rupture. The collapse of a narrative you didn't know you were depending on. The story of my life is good. The story of my marriage is true. The story of who I thought I was, all of it, suddenly exposed as unreliable. For some people, betrayal produces grief. For Shahryar, it produced something more dangerous, a story. The story he told himself in the aftermath of his wife's betrayal was simple and absolute and wrong. All women are this, every one of them. The world is this. There is no truth in it, no loyalty in it, no love that doesn't eventually become a weapon. And I who trusted am a fool, who will never be a fool again. This is a story, not a truth, a narrative constructed by a traumatized mind trying to find a framework that would prevent further pain, a way of making the unbearable make sense. But the story he constructed was catastrophic, because Shahryar was a king. And when a king writes a catastrophic story, he acts on it. He began to take a new wife each night, and each morning, before she could betray him, he had her executed. This went on for 3 years. City by city, families hid their daughters. The kingdom grieved. And Shahryar, locked inside his terrible story, could not see any of it. Scheherazade was the daughter of the king's vizier, the man whose job it was to find new brides for the king, and who had been carrying the weight of this task in silent anguish for 3 years. She was, by every account in the original text, extraordinary. She had read 1,000 books. She had studied philosophy, medicine, history, poetry. She knew the stories of ancient peoples, the wisdom of philosophers, the movements of the stars. She was, in the most complete sense, educated, and she had a plan. Her father begged her not to. He told her stories ironic, given what was coming, stories of people who had underestimated danger, who had walked knowingly into catastrophe. He pleaded. He tried to frighten her with the reality of what had happened to every woman who had entered that palace before her. She listened, she understood, and she went anyway. This is worth pausing on, because Scheherazade is sometimes framed as a victim of her circumstances, a woman who had no choice, who was simply clever enough to survive what was forced upon her. But the original text is clear. She volunteered, she chose. She went into that palace not because she had no options, but because she had looked at the situation, the king, the pattern, the kingdom full of grief and fear, and she had decided that she was the one who could change it, not through confrontation, not through escape, not through any form of force, through a story. She brought her younger sister Dunyazad with her, and between them they arranged a plan. In the night after the king had retired, Dunyazad would ask Scheherazade to tell a story. And Scheherazade would begin. On the first night, as dawn approached, as the time came when the king would give the order that would end her life, Scheherazade stopped. Not because she had run out of story. She stopped deliberately, at the most interesting point, at the moment when the listener most needed to know what happened next. She used something that psychologists now call the Zeigarnik effect, the brain's documented tendency to remember and fixate on unfinished things far more powerfully than completed ones. The brain does not like open loops. It wants resolution. It will keep returning to an unfinished story, an unresolved question, an incomplete task, because the incompleteness registers as a kind of low-level anxiety that can only be resolved by completion. Scheherazade created an open loop in the king's mind. She gave him something unfinished, and she was, conveniently, the only person who could finish it. The king, who had intended to have her executed at dawn, found himself in a position he had not anticipated. He wanted to know what happened next. This wanting small, almost petty compared to the enormity of what was at stake, was enough. He delayed the execution for one day, just to hear the end of the story. And Scheherazade, who knew exactly what she was doing, did not end the story. She began another one, and stopped again at dawn. And another day passed, and another night came, and another story began. One night became a week became a month became a year, and somewhere in that year something began to change in Shahryar that had nothing to do with story mechanics and everything to do with what stories actually do to the people who receive them. This is where the psychology becomes most interesting and most relevant to your own life. Scheherazade's stories were not chosen randomly. They were chosen with extraordinary care. They were stories about betrayal and loyalty, about love and loss, about kings who were wrong and admitted it, about the complexity of human motivation, about the fact that people, all people, even the people who hurt us, are more than the single action that defined them to us. She was not just entertaining Shahryar. She was re-educating him. Story by story, night by night, she was dismantling the catastrophic narrative he had built, that all women are faithless, that trust is foolishness, that the world contains no real loyalty, and replacing it so gradually he couldn't feel it happening with something more true. Cognitive psychologists call this narrative transportation, the state of being fully absorbed in a story, to the degree that the listener temporarily inhabits the perspective of the characters within it. And research has consistently found that narrative transportation changes beliefs and attitudes in ways that direct argument almost never does. Because when you argue with someone's belief, they defend it. The belief becomes more entrenched, not less. The more you push, the harder they hold. But when you tell someone a story, when you invite them into a world, into a character's experience, into the emotional reality of a situation, their defenses don't go up in the same way. They're absorbed. They're inside the story, and the story can reach them there in a way that nothing outside it could.
Scheherazade could not have looked Shahryar in the eye and argued him out of his terrible story. He would have had her executed before she finished the first sentence. But she could tell him a story about a king who was wrong, and then another story about a woman who was faithful, and then a story about the cost of absolute judgment,
and then a story about what happens when a person mistakes their wound for the truth about the world, night after night after night, until the king began to dream differently.
Let's step out of the Persian palace for a moment and come closer to home. Because Scheherazade's story is not just about a woman and a king, it is about the stories we tell ourselves about our own lives, and what happens when those stories go wrong. Every person is living inside a narrative, not a conscious, deliberate narrative, but a story that runs underneath the surface of daily life, organizing experience, assigning meaning, determining which events register as significant and which can be ignored. These narratives are built early. They are built from the material of our first experiences of the world. What love felt like, what safety felt like, whether people were reliable or not, whether we were valuable or not. And like Shahryar's narrative, they can be catastrophically wrong. Not wrong in the way a fact is wrong, but wrong in the sense of being a story that was true once, true to a particular experience at a particular moment, that has been generalized far beyond its original evidence, applied to situations it was never designed for, used to explain a world that has changed considerably since the story was first written. I am not lovable, built from a childhood of inconsistent love, applied to relationships where consistent love is actually available.
People always leave, built from early losses, applied to friendships that would have stayed if they'd been given the chance. If I am not useful, I have no value, built from environments where worth was conditional, applied to a life where it no longer needs to be. These stories run so deep and so automatically that most people don't experience them as stories at all. They experience them as reality, as simply the way things are. Scheherazade understood, before psychology had a language for it, that the way to change a life is to change the story that organizes it, and that changing a story requires patience and indirection, and the willingness to work from the inside rather than the outside. After 1,001 nights, after 2 years and 8 months and 28 days of stories, Scheherazade stopped, not because she had run out of stories. She had been managing her supply carefully, as any good storyteller would. She stopped because she had finished. She had 3 children by then, the king's children, born in the years of storytelling. She brought them to him and she said, "Spare my life for the sake of these children." But the king did not spare her life for the sake of the children. He spared it because he had been changed. The man who ordered a new execution each morning had, across 1,001 nights of stories, become someone who could no longer do that, who could no longer look at a woman and see only the potential for betrayal, who had been taken, story by story, into enough human complexity, enough moral nuance, enough genuine emotional experience that the terrible simple story he had built could no longer hold. The original text describes him as having fallen in love with Scheherazade, and this is true in the conventional sense. He loved her, but the love was not separate from what the stories had done. The love was, in part, a consequence of it. He had spent 1,000 nights inside her mind, seeing the world through the lens she offered him, being taken to places his own thinking could not reach. He knew her more completely than he had ever known anyone, because she had given him, night after night, the most intimate thing one person can give another, her stories. I want to stay with this idea for a moment as we move toward the quiet. You're here tonight, lying in the dark, at whatever hour this is for you, and your mind is doing what minds do in the dark. It is telling stories. It is organizing the day into a narrative. It is assigning meaning to things that happened. It is running the deeper stories underneath the ones about who you are and whether you are enough, and what the things that happen to you mean. Some of those stories are true. Some of them are the kind of true that Shahriyar's story was true, built from real experience, real pain, real loss, but generalized too far, applied too broadly, turned from a wound into a world view. I'm not going to tell you which stories those are, only you know that, but I want to offer you what Scheherazade offered the king. Not an argument, not a set of instructions, not a 5-step process for rewriting your narrative. Just this: the story you are telling yourself tonight about who you are, about what is possible, about what the people in your life mean and what they are capable of, is not the only story available. It is the story your mind wrote with the material it had, and your mind did its best with what it had. But the material is not all there is. There is more. There is always more. And somewhere in the quiet, in the space between one thought and the next, another story is possible, one that is no less honest, no less true to what actually happened, but perhaps a little more complete, a little more open, a little more able to hold the complexity of what you actually are and what the people around you actually are. That story is available to you, not tonight necessarily, not all at once, but night by night, story by story, the way Scheherazade did it. I want to speak very slowly now, to whoever is still listening. 4,000 years ago, perhaps longer, in the original oral tradition that preceded the written version, someone told this story for the first time. A woman in a palace, a king with a wound that had become a weapon. 1,001 nights of stories told in the dark to keep someone alive and to slowly, gently, unmistakably change them. The story survived. Across centuries and empires and languages and translations and retellings, it survived because it is about something that does not change. The power of a story told in the dark. The fact that we are here tonight, you, wherever you are, in whatever city, at whatever hour, is itself a small version of what Scheherazade did. You sought out a story. You came here to this quiet place to hear something that might reach the parts of you that the noise of the day cannot reach, and that reaching that search for the story that makes the night more bearable, the self more coherent, the world more navigable, is the oldest human impulse there is, older than writing, older than cities, older than almost everything. You're not just watching a video tonight. You're participating in something that human beings have been doing around fires and in palaces and in the dark for as long as there have been human beings. You're receiving a story, and the story, as it always has, is doing its quiet work. Let it. Let your mind go softer now. Let the stories of the day slow down, the ones that loop, the ones that worry, the ones that rehearse what might happen, or replay what already did. Let them be quiet. And let this one, the story of a woman who understood that the right story, told at the right moment, can change everything, be the last thing your mind holds tonight. You are here. You are listening. That is enough. That has always been enough.
If this reached you tonight, leave a comment. Just your city and the time. And if you want more nights like this one, subscribe. We're here every Monday, Thursday, and Sunday. Same quiet place, same honest voice. Good night, wherever you are.